The workhouse master threw a hungry boy into the street. A duke passed by and asked, "Who did this to you?" The boy's blood looked black against the cobblestones, and when the duke asked his question, gentle, impossibly gentle, the child didn't answer with words. He simply raised one trembling hand and pointed back at the iron gates of St. Bartholomew's workhouse, where Master Grimshaw stood watching with satisfaction, his leather straps still dangling from his meaty fist. The Duke followed that small, broken gesture, and something in his aristocratic face went very still, very cold. "I see," he said quietly, and in those two words lay a promise of reckoning that would reshape 3 lives forever. He bent down, lifting the boy as if he weighed nothing, cradling him against expensive wool now staining with blood and tears, and said the words that would haunt them both. "You're safe now. I give you my word as a gentleman." The boy, whose name was Christopher, though no one had used it in months, believed him, and that belief would prove both his salvation and his damnation. Wait before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning London's streets into rivers of filth and misery. Christopher had been thrown out into it just after dawn, punishment for stealing a crust of bread meant for Master Grimshaw's breakfast. Never mind that Christopher hadn't eaten in 2 days, that his ribs showed through his threadbare shirt like the bars of a cage. Never mind that he was 12 years old and small for his age, all hollow eyes and jutting bones. Theft was theft, and Master Grimshaw believed in swift, brutal justice. The beating had been savage even by workhouse standards. The leather strap had fallen across Christopher's back, his legs, his arms, as he'd curled into a ball on the cold floor. The other children had watched in terrified silence, knowing that any sound of protest would earn them the same treatment. When Christopher had finally stopped crying out, when he'd gone limp and quiet, Grimshaw had dragged him to the front door and hurled him into the street like refuse. "Don't come back," the master had bellowed. "Thieves that nothing from me but what they deserve." Christopher had lain there on the cobblestones, too dazed and hurt to move, while the rain soaked through his clothes and turned the blood from his wounds into pink rivers. Passers-by had stepped around him. A boy in the gutter was hardly an unusual sight in this part of London. Most assumed he was drunk or dead, and either way, not their concern. Then the carriage had stopped. It was a fine carriage, black lacquered wood with a ducal crest on the door, pulled by 4 matched grays that looked impossibly clean in the filthy street. The kind of carriage that usually rolled past without slowing, its wealthy occupants insulated from the misery outside by thick curtains and thicker indifference. But this carriage stopped. Christopher had heard the door open, heard expensive boots hitting the wet cobblestones. Through the haze of pain and rain, he'd seen a man approaching, tall, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than the entire workhouse's annual budget. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that was handsome in that austere, aristocratic way, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter storms. The Duke of Ashmont, though Christopher didn't know that yet. Alexander Ashford, 38 years old, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, stopping his carriage for a bleeding child in the gutter. "Good God," the Duke had said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that marked him immediately as someone from a different world. "Boy, are you alive?" Christopher had managed a small sound, not quite a word. The Duke had crouched beside him, heedless of the mud and rain ruining his expensive trousers, and that was when he'd asked his question, "Who did this to you?" Now, carried in the Duke's arms toward the waiting carriage, Christopher felt consciousness slipping. The pain was overwhelming, a fire that burned through every nerve. But beneath the pain was something else, a desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just this once, someone with power was going to help instead of hurt. The Duke's driver, a burly man with kind eyes, opened the carriage door wide. "Your Grace, you'll ruin your clothes. Let me—" "I'll manage, Thomas," the Duke said, his voice tight. "Drive to Ashmont House, quickly, and send someone ahead to fetch Dr. Morrison." Christopher was lifted into the carriage, settled on velvet seats that were softer than anything he'd ever touched. The Duke climbed in beside him, immediately removing his own coat to wrap around the shivering child. "What's your name?" the Duke asked gently. "Christopher," the boy whispered. "Christopher Ward, Your Grace." "Christopher." The Duke tested the name, then nodded. "I'm Alexander. Can you tell me what happened?" Through chattering teeth and tears that wouldn't stop, Christopher told him about the workhouse, about the endless hunger, about Master Grimshaw and his strap, and his belief that children were naturally wicked and required frequent beating to keep them in line. The Duke's face grew harder with each word, his jaw tightening until a muscle jumped in his cheek. "How long have you been at St. Bartholomew's?" "3 years, Your Grace, since my mother died." "And your father?" "Never knew him, sir. Mother said he was a sailor. Died before I was born." The Duke was silent for a moment, his storm-gray eyes studying Christopher with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "You're not going back there," he said finally. "Do you understand me? Whatever I have to do, however I have to arrange it, you're not going back to that place." Christopher wanted to believe him. God, how he wanted to believe him. But he'd learned in his short, hard life that promises from adults were usually lies dressed in pretty words. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but Master Grimshaw won't let you keep me. The workhouse has papers, legal papers, saying I'm bound there until I'm 14. "Then I'll buy those papers," the Duke said flatly. "Or I'll have St. Bartholomew's investigated and shut down. Or I'll—" He stopped himself, seeming to realize he was frightening the child. "Christopher, I have resources that Master Grimshaw cannot imagine. Trust me when I say that you will never have to see him again." The carriage rolled through London's streets, leaving the squalor of the East End for the grand neighborhoods where the wealthy lived behind iron gates and high walls. Christopher watched through the window, amazed by the transformation. Clean streets, trees, houses that looked more like palaces, with columns and gardens and the kind of beauty he'd only read about in the few books the workhouse had allowed him. "Can you read?" the Duke asked suddenly. Christopher nodded. "My mother taught me before she died, and the workhouse chaplain, he gave me books sometimes. Said it was a sin to waste a mind that wanted learning." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "That's good. Very good." Ashmont House was magnificent. Christopher stared up at the white stone facade, at the windows that glittered like diamonds, at the servants in perfect livery who came rushing out when the carriage pulled up. They stared at the bleeding child in their master's arms, at the Duke's ruined clothes, but none dared question him. "Mrs. Blackwood," the Duke called out, and a stern-looking woman in black silk appeared at the top of the stairs. "Prepare the blue bedroom. Hot water, clean linens, and tell Dr. Morrison he's needed immediately." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Your Grace, is that—" "A child who needs help," the Duke said firmly. "That's all you need to know for now." He carried Christopher inside, through halls hung with paintings and floored in marble, up a sweeping staircase that seemed to go on forever. Christopher caught glimpses of luxury beyond imagining. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, furniture that looked too perfect to actually sit on. The blue bedroom was larger than the entire sleeping room at St. Bartholomew's, which had housed 40 boys. The bed was enormous, piled with quilts and pillows. Windows overlooked a garden where roses still bloomed despite the autumn chill. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the space until Christopher stopped shivering for the first time in hours. The Duke set him down carefully on the bed, and Christopher immediately tried to stand, aware that his filthy, bloody clothes were ruining the pristine linens. "Stay," the Duke commanded gently. "The sheets can be washed. You cannot be replaced." Mrs. Blackwood arrived with an army of maids carrying hot water, towels, and clothing. Dr. Morrison followed soon after, a distinguished older man with spectacles and a no-nonsense manner. "Out," he told the Duke after one look at Christopher. "I need to examine him, and he'll be more comfortable without an audience." For a moment, the Duke looked as if he might argue. Then he nodded. "I'll be just outside. Call me if you need anything." The examination was painful but thorough. Dr. Morrison cleaned wounds, applied salves, bandaged Christopher's back where the strap had broken skin. All the while, he kept up a running commentary that was somehow soothing despite the clinical nature of his words. "Malnutrition," he muttered, "severe, multiple contusions, evidence of repeated beatings over an extended period. Good God, what kind of place?" He stopped himself, glancing at Christopher's face. "You're a brave lad. This must hurt terribly." "I've had worse," Christopher said, which was true but seemed to disturb the doctor even more. When the examination was complete, when Christopher had been cleaned and dressed in a nightshirt that was far too large but blissfully soft, Dr. Morrison called the Duke back in. "He needs rest, good food, and time to heal," the doctor said bluntly. "The physical wounds will mend, but, Your Grace, this child has been systematically abused. The psychological will be addressed," the Duke said firmly. "Whatever he needs, cost is irrelevant." Dr. Morrison studied the Duke with open curiosity. "May I ask, Your Grace, what your intentions are? This boy is under my protection," the Duke said. "That's all anyone needs to know." When they were alone, the Duke pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Christopher, drowsy from the laudanum the doctor had given him for pain, blinked up at this strange, powerful man who'd plucked him from the gutter. "Why?" Christopher asked. "Why did you stop for me?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment. "My brother," he said finally. "I had a younger brother once, Henry. He died when he was about your age, 12. An accident, they said, though I've always suspected it was more than that. He was attending Eton, and there were rumors of bullying, of older boys who made his life hell. But our father refused to investigate, said it would be unseemly to make a fuss." His voice went hard. "Henry drowned in the river. They found him 3 days later. And I was at university, too far away to help, too blind to see how badly he was struggling." "I'm sorry," Christopher whispered. "So am I." The Duke reached out, then stopped himself before touching Christopher's hand. "When I saw you in the street, bleeding and alone, all I could think was that you looked how Henry must have looked in his last moments, desperate, hurt, needing someone to intervene. And this time I could. This time I wouldn't be too late." "I'm not your brother," Christopher said, though something in his chest ached at the sadness in the Duke's eyes. "No," the Duke agreed. "You're Christopher Ward, and Christopher Ward deserves better than he's received. So I'm going to ensure he gets it." "For how long?" Christopher asked, because he learned that good things never lasted. "Until the workhouse demands me back? Until you grow tired of having a gutter snipe in your fine house?" "Forever," the Duke said, and his voice carried absolute conviction. "I'm going to adopt you, Christopher. Legally, formally, completely. You're going to become my son and heir. You'll have every advantage, every opportunity. Education, travel, a future beyond anything you could have imagined at St. Bartholomew's. Christopher stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. But I'm nobody, a workhouse brat. Why would you? Because I can, the Duke said simply. Because it's right. And because— He paused, seeming to search for words. Because I see something in you, Christopher. Intelligence, resilience, courage. You survived 3 years in hell and came out still able to feel, to hurt, to care. That's rare. That's worth saving. The laudanum was pulling Christopher under, but he fought it long enough to ask one more question. What if I disappoint you? Impossible, the Duke said softly. You've already proven yourself brave enough to survive what would have broken most people. Anything beyond that is simply bonus. Christopher fell asleep believing him, and that belief would change everything. The transformation of Christopher Ward into Christopher Ashford took 6 months of legal maneuvering, public scandal, and private determination. The adoption was announced in the Times, and London society exploded with gossip. A duke adopting a workhouse boy, making him his heir? It was unprecedented, scandalous, absolutely delicious fodder for drawing room conversations across the city. "He's gone mad," declared the Dowager Countess of Pemberton at her weekly salon. "It's guilt over his brother's death," suggested Lady Caroline Vane. "The Duke never recovered from that loss. This is some sort of twisted atonement." "I heard the boy is actually his bastard," whispered Sir James Morton. "Perhaps this is his way of legitimizing him without admitting indiscretion." The Duke ignored it all. He had lawyers file the paperwork, paid St. Bartholomew's an obscene amount of money to surrender their claim on Christopher, and set about the business of turning a traumatized workhouse child into a gentleman. It was harder than either of them expected. Christopher had survived through wariness and distrust. He hoarded food in his room, certain that meals would stop coming. He flinched at sudden movements, expecting blows. He couldn't sleep through the night, plagued by nightmares of Master Grimshaw's strap and the cold, hungry darkness of the workhouse dormitory. The Duke met each challenge with patience that surprised even his own staff. When he found food hidden under Christopher's bed, he didn't scold. He simply sat down on the floor beside the boy and said, "You'll always have enough to eat here, I promise. But if having extra food nearby helps you feel safe, then keep it. Just let Mrs. Blackwood know so she can ensure it stays fresh." When Christopher had a nightmare so violent he fell out of bed and injured his rest, the Duke heard the commotion and came running in his dressing gown. He sat with Christopher until dawn, reading aloud from adventure novels until the boy finally fell asleep again. "You don't have to do this," Christopher said one morning at breakfast, 3 weeks into his new life. "I know I'm a burden. I know the gossip is hurting you. I could just go somewhere else. An orphanage, maybe, or—" No. The Duke set down his newspaper with deliberate care. "Christopher, look at me." The boy raised his eyes reluctantly. "You are not a burden," the Duke said firmly. "You are my son. Not by blood, perhaps, but by choice, which is far more meaningful. The gossip doesn't hurt me. It's simply noise made by people with too much time and too little character. And you're not going anywhere. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Alexander," the Duke corrected gently, "or father, if you're comfortable with that, but not sir, as if you're a servant." "Yes, father," Christopher said, testing the word. It felt strange in his mouth, foreign, but not unwelcome. The education began slowly. The Duke hired tutors, patient men and women who understood that Christopher's formal schooling had been minimal. They started with basics, reading comprehension, mathematics, history, Latin. Christopher absorbed it all like a sponge, his natural intelligence finally given room to flourish. "He's remarkable," reported Mr. Ellis, the mathematics tutor, after 2 months. "I've never seen a child grasp concepts so quickly. His mind is genuinely first-rate." The Duke beamed with pride, which made Christopher work even harder. He discovered he had a gift for languages, learning Latin and beginning French with ease. History fascinated him, particularly the stories of people who'd risen from nothing to greatness. Literature became his refuge. He could lose himself in books for hours, living vicariously through characters who were brave and clever and triumphant. But the social education was more difficult. "Stand up straight," instructed Mr. Pemberton, the deportment teacher. "You're a Duke's son now, not a workhouse urchin. Shoulders back, chin up. Confidence, boy." Christopher tried, but years of making himself small to avoid notice couldn't be undone in a few lessons. He still slumped, still kept his eyes down, still moved as if expecting to be struck. The Duke observed one particularly frustrating session and dismissed the teacher afterward. "You're trying to teach him to be someone he's not," he told Pemberton. "Christopher doesn't need to be imperious or haughty. He needs to be himself, just with better posture." "But, Your Grace, society expects." "Society can adapt," the Duke said flatly. "My son will not be broken and remade in their image. He's been broken enough for one lifetime." They found a middle ground. Christopher learned the basics of gentlemanly behavior, how to dress properly, how to address various ranks of nobility, how to conduct himself at formal dinners. But the Duke never tried to erase who Christopher fundamentally was: curious, compassionate, still carrying the scars of his past, but growing stronger around them. 4 months into his new life, Christopher was invited to his first society event, a small dinner party at the Duke's townhouse with a few carefully selected guests. Christopher was terrified. "I'll embarrass you," he said that afternoon, staring at the formal clothes laid out on his bed. "I'll use the wrong fork or say something foolish, and everyone will remember I'm just a workhouse boy playing dress-up." "Then you'll learn which fork is correct," the Duke said calmly. "And if you say something foolish, you'll be in good company. Half the peers in Parliament have made careers of saying foolish things. Christopher, perfection isn't required. Effort is." The dinner was a carefully orchestrated affair. The guests included Lord and Lady Hammond, an older couple known for their kindness, Dr. Morrison and his wife, and Professor Whitmore, a scholar from Oxford who'd advised the Duke on Christopher's education. All of them had been briefed. All of them were prepared to be welcoming. Christopher made it through the first course without incident. The second course went smoothly as well. By dessert, he'd relaxed enough to actually participate in conversation, answering Professor Whitmore's questions with growing confidence. "You have a gift for languages," the professor observed. "Have you considered studying at university? Oxford would be fortunate to have you in a few years." Christopher glanced at the Duke, who smiled encouragingly. "I hadn't thought that far ahead, sir, but I'd like to, very much." "Then you shall," the Duke said firmly. "Christopher will have every opportunity I can provide." Lady Hammond leaned forward, her eyes kind. "Your Grace, if I may say so, you've done a wonderful thing. This young man is clearly exceptional, and giving him a chance to flourish is the least I could do," the Duke interrupted. "Christopher's exceptionalism is his own. I merely removed the obstacles preventing it from being recognized." After the guests left, Christopher found the Duke in his study, working through correspondence. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, "for tonight, for all of it." "You did well," the Duke said, looking up with genuine pleasure. "I was proud of you." Something in Christopher's chest swelled at those words. "I'm still afraid I'll disappoint you," he admitted. "That one day you'll wake up and wonder why you bothered with me." The Duke set down his pen and gave Christopher his full attention. "Do you know why I chose adoption over simply sponsoring your education? Why I insisted on making you my legal heir?" Christopher shook his head. Because half measures feel like charity, the Duke said. And charity, however well-intentioned, always comes with conditions. The benefactor can change their mind, withdraw their support, decide you're not worth the investment. But a son, he paused, his voice softening. A son is permanent, irrevocable. You're not a project I can abandon when it becomes difficult. You're family, and family doesn't give up on each other. Even when the family is made, not born? Christopher asked. Especially then, the Duke said. Because made families are chosen families. We picked each other, Christopher. That makes the bond stronger, not weaker. Christopher was 15 when the nightmares finally stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if some internal switch had finally flipped. He woke one morning and realized he'd slept through the entire night without once dreaming of Master Grimshaw's strap or the cold floors of St. Bartholomew's. It's progress, Dr. Morrison told the Duke when asked about it. The mind heals just as the body does. It just takes time. But it wasn't just time. It was safety, Christopher realized. 3 years of consistent kindness, of promises kept, of a home that remained stable no matter what. His body had finally accepted what his mind was slowly learning. He was safe now. He was loved. He was home. The gossip about the Duke's unusual adoption never fully died, but it evolved. Society, having thoroughly chewed over the scandal, began to see the romance in it. A powerful Duke rescuing a boy from poverty, giving him every advantage, demonstrating the kind of nobility that came from character rather than blood. They're making you into a fairy tale, Christopher observed dryly after reading yet another newspaper column speculating about his miraculous transformation. Better than a scandal, the Duke replied with amusement, though I suspect you'd prefer being neither. I'd prefer being invisible, Christopher admitted, but I suppose that's not possible anymore. No, the Duke agreed. You're a Duke's heir now. Visibility comes with the territory. But Christopher, he waited until the boy met his eyes. Never let their opinions define you. Not their praise, not their censure. You know who you are. That's what matters. At 17, Christopher entered Oxford. He excelled academically, particularly in modern languages and philosophy. He made friends cautiously, never quite forgetting that he was different, that his past set him apart. But he found a place for himself nonetheless, among other serious students who valued ideas over pedigree. The Duke visited monthly, ostensibly to ensure Christopher had everything he needed, but really just to spend time together. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. Dinner at a local tavern, walks along the river, hours spent in bookshops hunting for rare volumes. "You're happy," the Duke observed during one visit, and it wasn't a question. "I am," Christopher said, surprised to realize it was true. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do. That's a gift beyond measure." "You earned it," the Duke said firmly. "Never forget that, Christopher. Everything you've accomplished, you've done through your own merit and effort. I simply removed the obstacles." "You did more than that," Christopher said quietly. "You saw me. When I was just a bleeding boy in the gutter, you looked at me and saw a person worth saving. That changes everything." "You were always worth saving," the Duke said. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to recognize it." At 20, Christopher graduated from Oxford with highest honors. The Duke attended the ceremony, looking more proud than Christopher had ever seen him. Afterward, as they celebrated at a small dinner with Christopher's closest friends, the Duke made an announcement. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, "about Ashmont House and the estates. Christopher, you're my heir, but I want you to choose your own path. If you want to take over management of the family holdings, I'll teach you everything you need to know. But if you'd rather pursue scholarship or travel or anything else, We'll make arrangements." Christopher was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want to help people," he said finally. "Children, specifically. I want to do what you did for me. See them, believe in them, give them chances they wouldn't otherwise have. But on a larger scale." The Duke's eyes gleamed with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "Reform," Christopher said. "Of workhouses, orphanages, the entire system that treats poor children as disposable. I want to use our wealth and influence to change things, to ensure no other child suffers what I did." "Then that's what we'll do," the Duke said immediately. "Consider it your inheritance. Not just property and title, but a mission. We'll start a foundation, investigate institutions, lobby Parliament for reforms. You'll have my full support." They shook hands across the table, sealing not just an agreement, but a partnership. The Duke had saved one boy from a gutter 6 years ago, and now that boy was going to help save thousands more. The Ashford Foundation for Child Welfare was established on Christopher's 21st birthday. It was funded by a substantial portion of the Duke's wealth and governed by a board that included some of the most progressive reformers in England. Christopher threw himself into the work with an intensity that worried even the Duke. He visited workhouses unannounced, documenting conditions. He interviewed children, heard their stories, bore witness to their suffering. He compiled reports that made even hardened politicians blanch. "St. Bartholomew's is one of the worst," he reported to the board 6 months into his work. "But it's far from unique. Most institutions are overcrowded, underfunded, and run by people who view children as a burden rather than a responsibility." "What do you recommend?" asked Lord Pembroke, a reformist member of Parliament. "Shut them down," Christopher said bluntly. "All of them. Replace them with smaller homes, properly supervised, with education and care as the priority." "It's not enough to keep children alive. We need to give them futures." The campaign was long and difficult. They faced opposition from those who profited from the current system, from those who genuinely believed the poor deserved their suffering, from those who simply didn't care. But Christopher was relentless, and the Duke's influence opened doors that would have remained closed to a common reformer. 3 years after the Foundation's establishment, Parliament passed the Ashford Act, mandating minimum standards for child welfare institutions and establishing a system of regular inspections. It wasn't everything Christopher wanted, but it was a start. "You've changed lives," the Duke said on the night the act passed. "Thousands of children will have better futures because of what you've accomplished." "Because of we've accomplished," Christopher corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Without that day you stopped your carriage and asked who hurt me." The Duke smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I wish I could have been there for Henry, that I could have asked him the same question before it was too late." "Maybe you couldn't save him," Christopher said gently, "but you saved me, and through me, you've saved so many others. That matters, Father. That's a legacy worth having." The Duke pulled Christopher into an embrace, and for a moment they were simply father and son, bound not by blood, but by something stronger: choice, love, and shared purpose. At 25, Christopher was running the foundation full-time, having proven himself a skilled administrator as well as a passionate advocate. He'd also become something of a celebrity in reform circles, his own history lending credibility to his work. "The workhouse boy who became a Duke's son," they called him in newspapers. "The voice of England's forgotten children." Christopher hated the attention, but recognized its usefulness. If his story could draw attention to the cause, could open hearts and wallets, then he'd endure the discomfort of being famous. It was at a foundation fundraiser that he met Dr. Eleanor Hartley. She was 23, newly qualified as a physician, one of the first women to achieve that distinction in England. She'd approached him after his speech, her eyes blazing with intelligence and passion. "Mr. Ashford, I want to work with your foundation," she said without preamble. "I specialize in pediatric medicine, and I have ideas about implementing health screenings in institutions. May I share them?" Christopher had been approached by dozens of people that evening, all wanting something. But there was something different about Dr. Hartley. A directness, a competence, an immediate sense that she was someone who got things done. "I'm listening," he said. They talked for an hour, oblivious to the party continuing around them. Her ideas were brilliant. Systematic health checks for all institutionalized children, treatment protocols, preventative care. Christopher found himself not just impressed, but captivated. "Join us," he said when she finished. "The foundation needs someone with your expertise." "I was hoping you'd say that," she replied with a smile that made his heart stutter. The Duke noticed immediately. "You're smitten," he said the next day with amusement. "I'm professional," Christopher protested weakly. "You're smitten," the Duke repeated, "and I'm delighted. Dr. Hartley is clearly exceptional. Though I should warn you, courting a woman as intelligent and accomplished as she is will require more than charm." "I have charm?" Christopher asked, genuinely surprised. The Duke laughed. "More than you know. You just rarely use it. But, Christopher, seriously, if you care for her, tell her. Life is too short to waste on hesitation." Christopher took the advice to heart. Over the following months, as he and Eleanor worked closely together, he fell completely and irrevocably in love. She was brilliant, compassionate, and utterly unimpressed by his title or wealth. She valued him for his work, his ideas, his dedication to the cause they shared. "You're staring," she said one afternoon, looking up from a medical report to catch him watching her. "Sorry," Christopher said, "not sorry at all. I was just thinking how fortunate the foundation is to have you." "The foundation?" Eleanor repeated with a knowing smile. "Is that all?" Christopher took a breath. "No, I was thinking how fortunate I am to know you, to work with you, to—" He stopped, suddenly terrified. "Eleanor, I care for you, deeply. If you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I'd consider myself the luckiest man alive." Eleanor set down her papers and moved closer. "A fraction?" she said. "Christopher, I've been in love with you since our second meeting. I thought you'd never notice." He kissed her then, there in the foundation's offices, surrounded by reports and reforms and the work that bound them together. It was perfect. The Duke approved of the match enthusiastically. "She's perfect for you," he declared. "Intelligent, independent, dedicated, and clearly besotted with my son, which shows excellent judgment." They married a year later, in a ceremony that drew together an eclectic mix of guests. Peers and politicians, reformers and physicians, even a few of the children whose lives the foundation had changed. The Duke gave Christopher away, tears streaming down his face through the entire ceremony. "Happiness looks good on you," he told Christopher afterward. "You deserve every moment of joy you can find." "So do you," Christopher said, noting the sadness that sometimes still lingered in his father's eyes. "You've spent so much time ensuring my happiness. When will you consider your own?" "I am happy," the Duke insisted. "Seeing you thrive, seeing the work you're doing, watching you build a life with Eleanor, that's more than enough for me." But Christopher worried. The Duke was 50 now, still vigorous and engaged, but increasingly alone. He'd never remarried after his wife's death years before Christopher's adoption, had poured all his energy into raising his unexpected son and supporting the foundation. "He needs something of his own," Eleanor observed one evening. "Something beyond us, beyond the work, a passion or purpose that's purely his." "I know," Christopher agreed, "but he's always been more focused on others than himself." The answer came unexpectedly when the Duke began writing. He'd always been an avid reader, but at Eleanor's suggestion, he started documenting his experiences, raising Christopher, establishing the foundation, navigating society's expectations while following his conscience. "It's a memoir," he explained when Christopher discovered the manuscript, "or perhaps philosophy. I'm not entirely sure, but writing it has been clarifying, therapeutic even. The book, published anonymously as Reflections on Parenthood and Purpose, became an unexpected success. Readers were drawn to its honesty, its exploration of what it meant to do right in a world structured around privilege and injustice. Society speculated endlessly about the author's identity, never suspecting it was one of their own. "You've started a conversation," Christopher told him after reading it. "People are questioning things they've always taken for granted. That's powerful." "I learned from the best," the Duke said with a smile. "You've been questioning unjust systems since the day we met. I'm simply following your example." At 30, Christopher stood in the remodeled St. Bartholomew's Workhouse, now St. Bartholomew's Children's Home, and tried not to cry. Bright classrooms instead of dark dormitories, a modern kitchen serving nutritious meals, playrooms and gardens, and everything he dreamed of during those 3 hellish years. Master Grimshaw had asked earlier, part of him still fearing he'd encounter his tormentor. "Dismissed years ago," the new director assured him. "There was an investigation after your adoption became public. He was found guilty of numerous abuses and served prison time. He's forbidden from ever working with children again." Relief flooded through Christopher. Justice, however delayed, had come. The opening ceremony was well attended. Eleanor stood beside him, 7 months pregnant with their first child. The Duke was there too, looking older now but still sharp-eyed and engaged. "This is where it began," Christopher said quietly to them both, "where I was broken and thrown away. And now it's a place where children will be built up instead of torn down." "It's a monument," the Duke said, "not to suffering, but to survival, to the possibility of change. I'm proud of you, son, prouder than I have words to express." "I wouldn't be here without you," Christopher said. "Everything I've accomplished started the day you stopped your carriage and asked who hurt me." "No," the Duke corrected gently. "It started the day you survived long enough for me to find you. Your strength, your resilience, that's what made all of this possible. I simply gave you space to flourish." Their daughter was born 2 months later, healthy and loud and perfect. They named her Alexandria, after her grandfather, and the Duke wept openly when he held her for the first time. "She'll never know hunger," Eleanor said, watching the tender way the Duke cradled the baby. "She'll never fear being hurt or abandoned. She'll grow up safe and loved and certain of her worth." "That's the greatest gift we can give her," Christopher agreed. "The gift of never having to survive what I did." But they didn't shelter Alexandria from the truth. As she grew, they told her about her father's past, about the workhouse and the rescue and the years of healing. They wanted her to understand that privilege was a responsibility, not a right, that those who had much owed much to those who had little. "Why was grandfather at St. Bartholomew's that day?" Alexandria asked when she was 7, trying to understand the story. "What made him stop?" "Grace," the Duke said simply. "Sometimes we're given opportunities to do the right thing. The grace is in recognizing them and having the courage to act." At 35, Christopher succeeded his father as Duke of Ashmont. The transition happened gradually, naturally, as the older man's health began to fail. There was no sudden crisis, just the inevitable passage of time and responsibility. "You're ready," the Duke told him during one of their final conversations. "More than ready. You'll be a better Duke than I ever was." "Impossible," Christopher said, his throat tight. "You set the standard. Everything good I know about leadership, about responsibility, about being a man of character, I learned from watching you." "Then I've succeeded," the Duke said with satisfaction. "A parent's greatest achievement is raising a child who surpasses them, and you, my son, have done that in every way." The Duke died peacefully in his sleep a week later, surrounded by family. Christopher held his hand through the final hours, reading aloud from the adventure novels they'd once shared, bringing the old man comfort as he'd once been comforted. The funeral was enormous, a duke's funeral, with all the ceremony society demanded. But afterward, there was a smaller, private memorial at St. Bartholomew's Children's Home. The children living there now, beneficiaries of the reforms Christopher had fought for, sang songs and shared stories about how the foundation had changed their lives. "He saved my father," one girl said solemnly, "and my father saved me. So even though I never met him, I know he was a hero." "He was," Christopher agreed, tears streaming down his face. "He absolutely was." Eleanor held him that night as he grieved, letting him cry for the father who'd chosen him, who'd seen value in a broken boy when the rest of the world saw only trash. "He gave me everything," Christopher said, "a home, an education, a purpose. But most of all, he gave me proof that I was worth saving, that I mattered. That's a gift I can never repay." "You repay it every day," Eleanor said gently, "through the work you do, the children you help, the love you give. He knew that. It's why he died at peace." As the new Duke of Ashmont, Christopher expanded the foundation's work even further. He established schools, funded medical clinics, created apprenticeship programs. He used every ounce of his wealth and influence to ensure that poor children had opportunities, that they were seen and valued and given chances to thrive. "You're obsessed," Eleanor teased one evening, finding him still working at midnight. "I'm driven," Christopher corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there? When was the last time you took a full day off?" Christopher considered. "I took Sunday afternoon off last month. We walked in the garden." "For 2 hours," Eleanor said. "Christopher, I understand the passion. I share it. But you'll burn yourself out at this pace." "I can't stop," Christopher admitted. "Every time I think about resting, I remember the children still suffering, still hungry, still afraid, still convinced they don't matter. How can I rest when they can't?" "Because you'll be no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion," Eleanor said firmly. "The Duke wouldn't want this. He'd want you to find balance, to take joy in life, to remember that you're not just a reformer. You're a husband, a father, a person deserving of happiness." She was right, of course. Christopher forced himself to slow down, to spend more time with Alexandria and their younger son, Henry, named for the uncle he'd never met, to find moments of peace and joy amidst the work. But he never stopped entirely. The drive to help, to save, to ensure no child suffered as he had, it was too deeply rooted, too much a part of who he was. At 50, Christopher was widely regarded as one of England's great reformers. The Ashford Act had been strengthened multiple times. Dozens of institutions had been transformed. Thousands of children had been given chances they would never have had otherwise. But Christopher's proudest moment came when a young man approached him after a speech, his eyes bright with determination. "Your Grace, my name is James Miller. I grew up in an institution reformed by your foundation. I'm at Oxford now, studying law. I want to continue your work, to help children the way you helped me." Christopher saw himself in those eyes, the hunger for knowledge, the determination to make a difference, the understanding that came from personal suffering transformed into purpose. "Tell me about yourself," Christopher said, and they talked for hours. James became his protege, then his friend, eventually joining the foundation's leadership. Others followed, men and women whose lives had been changed by the reforms, who wanted to pay forward what they'd received. "This is your legacy," Eleanor told Christopher on their 30th wedding anniversary. "Not just the institutions you've changed, but the movement you've built. People who believe as you do that every child matters." "It's his legacy too," Christopher said, looking at a portrait of the Duke that hung in his study. "Everything traces back to that day, to his choice to stop, to ask, to care. And your choice to survive until he found you," Eleanor added. "Don't forget that part. You were worth saving before he arrived. His grace was in recognizing it, but your value was always there." At 70, Christopher was old by the standards of his era, his hair white and his body frail. But his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to the work never wavered. He'd lived to see the complete transformation of England's child welfare system, had witnessed changes he'd only dreamed of in his youth. Alexandria, now a reformer in her own right, ran the foundation. Henry had become a physician like his mother, specializing in pediatric care for poor children. They were continuing the work, ensuring it would outlast him. "I'm content," Christopher told Eleanor one quiet evening in their library. "I've had a good life, better than I ever imagined possible when I was lying in that gutter, broken and bleeding." "No regrets?" Eleanor asked. "Only one," Christopher admitted. "I wish the Duke could see all of this, see how far we've come, how many lives we've changed. I wish I could thank him one more time." "He knows," Eleanor said with certainty. "Wherever he is, he knows, and he's proud." Christopher died peacefully a year later, surrounded by family, his hand in Eleanor's. His last words were spoken so softly that only she heard them. "Thank you for seeing me, for staying." The funeral was a national event. Parliament adjourned in his honor. Thousands lined the streets to pay respects. But the most moving tribute came from St. Bartholomew's Children's Home, where every child gathered to sing, their voices raised in songs of hope and gratitude. They erected a statue in the courtyard where Christopher had once been thrown into the street. It showed two figures, a man bending down to lift a boy, their hands clasped, both their faces turned toward the future. The inscription read, "Who did this to you? Who will help you? These are the questions that change the world." Alexandria unveiled it through tears, her own children standing beside her. "My father was saved by someone who chose to see him," she told the crowd, "and he spent his life ensuring others were seen." That's the legacy he leaves us. Not wealth or title, but the obligation to look, to ask, to care. To recognize that every person, no matter how broken or forgotten, has infinite worth. Years later, historians would debate Christopher's impact, quantifying the children saved, the laws passed, the system transformed. But his real legacy lived in the countless people who'd been given chances because one duke stopped his carriage on a rainy morning and asked a bleeding child who had hurt him. That question had changed 3 lives. The boy who learned he was worth saving, the duke who learned that nobility came from action rather than birth, and Eleanor, who'd found in Christopher a partner who understood that love and purpose were inseparable. But mostly, it had changed the world. One child at a time, one institution at a time, one heart at a time. Because someone had stopped, someone had asked, someone had cared. And that had made all the difference. The end.